So my name's Casey Ellis. I am probably best known as the founder of Bugcrowd, also the co-founder of the Disclosure project. There are so many different things to work on when it comes to security as a stack. You know, like I said before, I've been doing this since I finished high school and arguably during high school as well. And we focus on the network layer, we focus on AppSec, we focus on like national security, all those different things. Like to me, like the user has and will always be the final frontier from a security standpoint, because there's no real need to secure the internet without the users being affected by the downside of bad things happening. So I've always been a strong believer in that as kind of a primitive of what we all are here to do as an industry. And to see people actually directly working on that and trying to improve the situation, I've always gravitated towards that. And that whole idea of like the human being really ultimately the final frontier, and an element of defensive security that's often kind of ignored and overlooked. So you guys were way ahead of the curve on that, I think. My mindset coming into this is kind of the like weird hacker CEO hybrid. So I'm generally thinking offensively and with the executive hat on at the same time. And I think on top of that, Bugcrowd's very much a community-driven organization, so that it's a very public role, and there's a lot of people, a lot of interaction in that. What I've seen over the past probably year or two in particular is just an increased hostility towards executives. I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, like the economy and kind of the economic pressure that employees, workers, and even the unemployed are under at this point in time. That seems to be ramping up. You've got far more open conversations around whether someone agrees or disagrees with executive decision making, and I think that's bubbled up. You look at some of the the incidents that have happened. Assassinations and different things like that. Like there's this narrative that's always sort of been there. I think that's always been a dynamic to kind of manage out in the market, but it feels like over the past year or two, it's become far more open. On the executive side, to me, that's a trigger for mindfulness. Like I'm never a believer in the idea of being scared into disappearing, if that makes sense. And like I said before, like part of what I do is very public facing. So I'm out in the community, amongst people, all that kind of stuff. I love that. I never want to stop doing that. But, for me, I am definitely a little bit more mindful around my kind of risk environment as I do that, these days compared to even 2 years ago. Well, I think the role of AI in kind of the context of this conversation is twofold. I think it's putting and it's being used as an excuse in some areas. I think it's actually both. Enormous pressure on companies, on employees, like the threat of being laid off and replaced by AI is like hanging over the workforce as this kind of existential, threat or existential dread. And those sorts of environments are the ones that, tend to kick off at some point. So there's that. I think as well, AI, just the ability to do OSINT quickly, like agentic frameworks that you can spin up on your own laptop, hook them into Claude, and go off and do multiple searches on your own device without anyone else even necessarily realizing what you're doing. Like that's that kind of capability is in the hands of most people at this point in time. So if you're sufficiently determined to stalk someone and like get up in their grill, it's always been possible to do that. You just need to know the tradecraft and all that kind of stuff. But now it's like easier, and I think it's accessible as an option to a broader variety of people. The thing that drove interest, in that moment was actually an incident that we were dealing with. So there was a precipitating event, and like I said before, having worked as kind of a frontline executive in a community of hackers for the last 13 years, I'm no stranger to people getting grumpy about stuff and popping off. It's kind of an occupational hazard. But in this particular incident, there was some specificity to it that kind of demanded a different response. So There was a couple of things that got kicked off by that, but one of them was to reach out to you guys, actually to get some assistance with kicking off the response too. So many thanks for that part. But in terms of the actual platform and the product going forward, it's like, all right, we as a team need to do something about this and need to be in a position where we're responding proactively going forward, and really like having things out there that have our back even when we don't realize that there's a risk that we're introducing or there's a threat that might be coming up, right? And VanishID is kind of designed to do that, right? I think the other thing is that, I've always operated on this principle, like it's a product and a company design principle that I believe really strongly in, but I think it's partly just a product of how I try to do security myself. You want it to be easy and you want insecure to be obvious, right? Like if you've got a security control that creates friction, you're eventually going to start to work around it and dilute the control. So the fact that we're able to just give the relevant pieces of information over to you guys and have flick the switch and kind of turn the whole thing on, I think that was a really good advantage in a pretty chaotic like post-incident environment as well. So we're trying to set all this stuff up at the same time as settling the different things that were going on at the time down. And like the easier and the more effective you can bring, like the easier and more effective a control you can bring into an environment like that, I think the better. The biggest piece of advice would be to not underestimate how exposed you are at any given point in time, because I think even people that are quite security and privacy conscious, there's leakage, there's data brokers, there's all these different things that happen behind the scenes that you're not necessarily directly in control of. And when you go and properly do a hunt for like how exposed is my information, like 9 times out of 10 you find way more than you thought you would. So like the starting point would be, don't presume that you're anonymous on the internet. Actually assume that you're not is probably a safer starting point. And then you can kind of invoke the curiosity of that to go out and try to start to solve the problem, or to at least see whether or not that's true and if you should do something about it. The definition of privacy used to be just secrecy, like way back in the day. And I think like right across the board, it's like the modern version of that is that I get to control what goes where. For executives, especially for founders and entrepreneurs, like marketing, promotion of your own brand, promotion of the brand that you're building, that's all part of the deal. So this balancing act between doing that and then maintaining privacy around, the pieces of information that are impactful. That's a really tight balancing act. I think my version of that's been really interesting because it's not so much about seen and not found. Like part of it for me with community is actually to be found as well, right? So, okay, how? And what are the things that we're blocking off? What are the things that we're enabling? And where are the control points around that? And who can I get help from to actually make that happen? To me, that's a big part of, when we're talking about getting set up. I remember a bunch of conversations that you and I had. You had some context already based on having known each other in the past, but talking through this idea that like I am not in a position with what I do where I can just drop into a cave and disappear. I've got to find some sort of happy medium there, and being able to work with you guys to figure that out was helpful, because it is a really confusing set of things to unpack, especially if you're already kind of out there in the public eye, right? So I think like that's going to be a consideration for pretty much anyone who's, especially entrepreneurs and folks that are kind of doing the hockey stick thing right now, because like you're just hustling, trying to get your stuff out there as much as you possibly can, and probably not thinking about this side of it in the background. OPSEC doesn't work anywhere near as well in reverse. So it's a good thing to start thinking about sooner rather than later, I think. The onboarding experience for us at VanishID was really simple. It was, like literally a matter of getting together different data points, and I think a couple of conversations back and forth around different details that are useful for the platform to be able to kick things off. getting feedback from that pretty quickly around like what is the exposure level, what are the actual risks that exist within those exposures that might not be, things that I'm thinking about, and then what do we want to do about that going forward. It was very simple from like a procedural standpoint. I think the other thing that I really liked about it was kind of empathic, for want of a less fluffy way of putting it. Like the idea that like, yeah, this is like, potentially scary stuff that we're talking about here. What I experienced was VanishID stepping into my shoes as the user and thinking through the problems that I'm trying to solve and actually helping me walk through that in the process, which was a huge thing.